Welcome to Downtown Sports. My name is Downtown Steven Brown, and in today's video, guys, I want to talk about what we learned from the Amazon series All or Nothing about the Toronto Maple Leafs last year. Obviously, it goes without saying, but there will be spoilers in this video, and I'm not just going to go through the events of what happened in the dock. That would be boring. I'm going to pick out a couple of things that I found interesting and break those down using some analytics and some context and other things that I remember. But the day before the series drops on Amazon Prime, the Maple Leafs are going to extend Sheldon Keefe with a 2-year contract extension through the 2023-2024 season. If you really want to get to know Sheldon Keefe and how he wants his hockey teams to play, I would watch this series. That is definitely a reason to. Pay attention especially to the scenes where Sheldon Keefe is addressing the team pre-game in the Maple Leafs locker room, because there's literally a giant video board on the wall behind him giving away the team's strategy, basically going into that game, the areas in which he wants his team to focus on. On the screen right now are the lines that the Maple Leafs used in their first game of the season last year. And the first thing that I found interesting in the series is Kyle Dubas is sitting in his office and Sheldon Keefe kind of walks in and they're having a conversation about what their biggest concern for last year's team was going to be. And they both came to a consensus that it was going to be their offense. And as the conversation kind of continued, Sheldon Keefe explained that he was worried about this team offensively when there's less time and space to create offense. And he made note that the team doesn't really score or generate a lot of opportunities off of rebounds. The Maple Leafs generate a ton of scoring chances, but when you have less time and space, it's often those second and third opportunities that can get you that extra goal or two that you need to kind of push you over the hump. And I know that John Tavares and William Nylander have scored a lot of goals from in tight over the last couple of seasons, but I wouldn't necessarily describe them as having a nose for the net. So who were we really expecting on this team last year to crash the net? Who can we expect on this year's team to maybe fill that role? There's not really a large sample when it comes to Michael Bunting, but if you look at the areas of the ice where he did take his shots last year with the Coyotes at 5-on-5, a lot of those coming from right in front of the net. If we're taking a look at Nick Ritchie, who you do have a larger sample size for, the shots are spread out in the offensive zone, but there's a large cluster right there in front of the net at 5-on-5. And if we're looking at Ondrej Kase over the course of his career, again, a lot of those shots coming from right in front of the net. I made notes as I was watching the documentary, and we're not going to go over every single bullet point, but I want to touch on the Ottawa loss that revealed the Leafs of old. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's the game where they were up 5-1 over the Senators, and they blew it and lost 6-5 in overtime. Dadonov comes in on the breakaway with Riley trailing him, just didn't have enough gas at the end of his shift. He scores, they lose that game. But the feeling that I got from Sheldon Keefe after that game happened was that he felt that the team, up until that point, had made a lot of positive progress towards those Stanley Cup habits that he preaches. And you know what? I got to agree with him. 11-3-1, that's friggin' amazing. Maybe the teams in the North Division weren't the best defensively, but you're not going to tell me that that division, it didn't have a lot of offensive star power. And the Maple Leafs went from being 27th in the NHL in goals against per 60 at 5-on-5 to 6th in the entire league last season against really potent offensive lineups. And that's not just from getting great performances from Jack Campbell and adding TJ Brodie, who they didn't mention once, I don't think, throughout the entirety of that series. But it's definitely some of it. But the team did visibly improve defensively. And that's a testimony to the coach and getting growth out of your players. But, you know, if they're taking 3 steps forward and then 4 steps back with that Ottawa game, you kind of have to wonder if maybe that was something that kind of lingered on, you know, mentally. It's there. It happened. Not really anything to be analytical about, but Joe Thornton is a adorable, happy-go-lucky goof. And while I'm glad that he's not on the team this year, I'm glad that he was last year and the core group of guys got to be around him and experience that. The media had gotten to see this series about a month or so ago, and that's when the information that Ilya Mikheyev had requested a trade had come out. And I talked about that in depth in a previous video, and I'll leave that linked above the screen and at the end of this one if you want to check that out. So I'm not going to go too in depth on it now, but you get to see that conversation between him and Dubas play out in one of the episodes. I had that in my notes, and I thought I would touch on it because of this tweet from October the 3rd here. Matthews between Ritchie and Marner, Tavares between Mikheyev and Nylander. Which I still really don't know what the Maple Leafs do with their lines because there are so many options, and maybe that's a good thing and not a bad thing. But at the same time, a lot of people kind of wanted to see Michael Bunting there, or maybe even a guy like Josh Ho-Sang, who's still on a PTO and they haven't signed. But that kind of brings me to the next thing that I want to talk about, and that's giving guys opportunities and making them find a purpose. There's a scene in episode 2 where Sheldon Keefe kind of skates over to Jimmy Vesey in the middle of practice, and he's talking about how he hasn't liked his game up until that point in the season. From a coaching and a player development standpoint, if you can take a player who had skill and raw talent and you can give them a new purpose and they accept that role, you could get a lot of value out of that player. And especially for a team like the Leafs, who need to be able to plug holes in their lineup with cheap guys, that could be huge. You know, guys like Jimmy Vesey, guys like Alex Galchenyuk, guys like Josh Ho-Sang, guys who have that talent, guys who have that skill. You know, if they can find a purpose, they're going to be able to be effective for you. It just depends on how receptive and how open that player is to kind of changing their role in their game. And I'm not bashing Jimmy Vesey, but I think that this is something that Josh Ho-Sang can kind of speak to, and he did about a week or so ago, and I'll leave the clip of that in the video description. But he basically said that Kyle Dubas and Sheldon Keefe really wanted to get to know him, and they really wanted to know what he wanted. And that's not something that other teams had done for him up until this point. You know, you see the value that they got from a guy like Alex Galchenyuk, and obviously he had the unfortunate turnover in the playoffs, and you can't undo years of bad habits in the short amount of time that they had with him. But I feel like if they had more time, they could have gotten more from him. Especially towards the beginning when he was first called up from the Toronto Marlies, he showed a willingness to change the role that he had played previously. He was willing to do things that he hadn't really done up until that point in his career. He was more involved defensively. He was a much more responsible player, and it was really fun and exciting to watch. You know, Sidney Crosby is Sidney Crosby, but the Penguins have also done a pretty good job with finding guys who are willing to learn how to play with him, right? Obviously, that sounds kind of weird, but you have to have guys who are willing to play that specific role to fit his game and be a complementary piece for him. And if the Leafs can do that with their big guys, it would be really nice. And I'll just show you the rest of my notes here because there's only so many takeaways that you can have from yet another epic collapse. But the thing that I want to touch on before I talk about Jake Muzzin is that the players, the coaches, management, they feel how we feel, right? And if you watch that, you'll really understand that they feel how we feel. The difference is they can't just fire up NHL 22 and just do whatever they want, and if it doesn't work out, load up the save file again and try over, right? They need to be a little bit more methodical with things, and you need to be willing to have some sort of patience, but you also need to be able to alter the plan and blah, blah, blah. You know, it carries on and on and on. You can talk about it in a vicious cycle if you really wanted to. When it comes to Jake Muzzin, you can really tell that the coaching staff respects him and leans on him to be a leader. And it really does feel like whatever he touches kind of turns to gold. And if you have a young defenseman and you want to develop that player, you should play him next to Jake Muzzin. And it's something that I touched on in my previous video, and I'll have that linked above the screen and at the end of the video for you, but play him next to Jake Muzzin. And just to kind of talk about Nick Foligno, it was really clear that he was in a lot of pain when he got injured again in that Montreal series. And the fact that he came back at all and then volunteered to play center was a miracle. And the fact that 3 other teams had a first-round pick on the table for him, if that was their guy, that was their guy. You know, Sheldon Keefe had talked about the rebound offense and needing to be versatile and needing to learn how to score when there's less time and space. If that's what they were going for, they got their guy. It just didn't work out. I guess that happens sometimes. Throughout the series, they didn't mention the power play drought, like, at all, which I thought was kind of weird because it was historic and it was a huge focal point of last year. And is going into this season. And like I said earlier, they didn't mention Brody either, which I thought was weird because he formed one of the most consistent and best defensive pairings in the entire league last year. It just, I don't know, that felt kind of weird to me. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on that we learned is how early on in the season Auston Matthews was really dealing with that wrist injury. If I'm kind of remembering it correctly, we were hearing about that towards the last 10, 15 games of the season or so, but they talked about him dealing with this like in the first 10 or 15 games of the year. And for him to have the kind of season that he did was remarkable. And he had the surgery, obviously, and he's going to be ready for opening night this year. And I'm excited to see what he can do. And hopefully that's something that doesn't hold him back, because he's a special player. And the Leafs are really going to need him this year. But that's going to be it for this video, guys. Make sure to like the video if you did like it, and subscribe for more, because more is always on the way. And let me know what your thoughts and opinions are down below. Have you watched it? What are your thoughts? Are you going to watch it now that you've heard a little bit about it from this video? Are you planning on just not touching it because you want to move on from it? I think the main takeaway from me is that the players feel the exact same way that we do. Seeing Auston Matthews and Mitch Marner sitting next to each other in the dressing room after the series had ended, they're wearing like half their stuff and they're like lifeless. Like that is exactly how I felt watching the game, and I'm sure that's how a lot of you felt. And seeing Jack Campbell cry, and it's not a good feeling. I know we've had enough. Hopefully they've had enough as well. And the season starts in 10 days. So I guess we'll see.